welcome to lesson 27. This is reading scales. So this is something that we see in everyday life, and the most common way that I can think of, well, there's reading temperature on an actual thermometer, which, not many of you probably actually see very often. And then there's actually, if you pay attention to maybe one of your parents driving, a speedometer. Speedometers have number lines that you have to be able to read. Number lines can be vertical, they can be horizontal, and they can also be curved, just like a speedometer. And they're not always going to have every single line labeled, so it's important to know how to read them correctly. Now, the first thing we're going to look at, which I know this is a little bit difficult to read, but I drew two thermometers. We have Celsius and Fahrenheit. Those are the two most common read degrees, or those are the two most common ways that we read temperature. There's other ways with science that people usually measure with, which is kelvins, but you don't ever see that. We see Fahrenheit everywhere in the US. And Celsius is actually used pretty much everywhere else. America just really likes to be different, honestly. So one thing that we are going to look at within this lesson is the freezing point of water. So when water freezes, we're going to look at what degrees it is Celsius and what it is Fahrenheit. I wrote it way down here. I guess I should have started there at the top. But my freezing point, the freezing point of water is 0 degrees Celsius and 32 degrees Fahrenheit. Now those are actually the exact same temperatures, but the Celsius scale reads differently than the Fahrenheit scale does, and so that's why they're two different numbers. They're off at a certain point. So if you were to go somewhere in Europe or even somewhere in South America or even in Mexico or Canada, and you see that it's 18 degrees Celsius, well, that's not going to be 18 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not freezing cold. So 0 degrees Celsius and 32 degrees Fahrenheit is the freezing point of water. So whenever we get below freezing in the winter, then that means it's below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So room temperature, meaning basically your middle range room temperature, is labeled as 20 degrees Celsius and 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So 68 degrees Fahrenheit is a room temperature rating. And then we also have boiling point of water. So when water begins to boil, it would be at 100 degrees Celsius and 212 degrees Fahrenheit. As you can see, there's pretty even numbers read with Celsius. Celsius is almost a little easier to read when you have 100 degrees Celsius, 20 degrees Celsius, and 0 degrees Celsius. So with Fahrenheit, you have to remember 212 for boiling point, 68 degrees for room temperature, and 32 degrees for freezing point. So we're going to go ahead and look at some scales as practice problems. Now for our example one that we're going to look at together, I know this is really difficult to read, but I have 60 degrees labeled right here, 70 degrees labeled here, and 80 degrees labeled here, and it's all on the Fahrenheit scale. You can look along in your book. It actually has a much easier picture to read because I'm not the best artist, I'll say. But we have to be able to read what is this counting by. That's the most important because the temperature ratings, each line is not marked by ones. So it's not 60, 61, 62, 63, 64. Oh, there's 70. We have to be able to figure out what is it counting by, and it's all going to be counted by the same number. So if I know it's not counting by ones, and between 60 and 70, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in between. Technically would be 5 lines. So actually, if I do 10 degrees here between 60 and 70, and I have 5 lines, it would be divided by 5, which is 2. Let's try if we count it by 2s and see if it works. 60, 62, 64, 66, 68, and there's 70, so it does line up properly. We could try it again from 70 to 80, 70, 72, 74, 76, 78, 80. It works again. So I know we're counting by 2s on the degrees for the Fahrenheit scale. And it's actually at the line right above the 70 degree Fahrenheit mark. So if you look, you can actually see in your book that it's labeled the line right above the 70, which we know it's counted by 2, so it's marked as 72 degrees Fahrenheit. So that would be what it's rated as. So example 2, what we're going to look at is we have a curved number line, kind of like a speedometer in a vehicle, and we have 200, 400, and 600 labeled with like 3 lines in between. And the best part about these lines, or these number lines, is that we have a larger line here, which is actually our halfway point between 600 and 400. And then we have a larger line here between 200 and 400. Well, those are my 100 marks, my halfway points. So halfway between 200 and 400 is 300. I know this is going to be 300, so I'm just going to write it in separately. And 400 and 600, I know this is going to be 500. Those are my halfway points. And then I have halfway between 500 and 600 here where my arrow is pointing. And what's halfway between 500 and 600? If you answered 550, you would be correct. That is my halfway point because 50 is always half of 100. So if I add on 50 between 500 and 600, that's my halfway mark, which is 550. It's where my arrow is pointing on the number line. Now example 3 says to draw a horizontal number line from 0 to 500 with only, keyword only, 0 and hundreds marked and labeled. That means 100, 200, 300, 400, 500. So those are your hundreds. Basically your multiples of 100s is what it's talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and draw my number line. I'm going to start with 0 because that's what it says to begin with. It's from 0 to 500. I'm going to have 500 here at the end. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and count. There's 100, 200, 300, and 400. And there's my number line with 0 and hundreds marked and labeled. Number lines, we know what they look like. We drew them, draw, and then you have arrows at the end because it does continue on and on forever. Numbers never end. And then I label them using the basically slash marks on the line. So thank you so much for paying attention. We'll go over some more scales and reading them in actual scales and pictures of them in real life so that you can see more of the application for real life and being able to practice those more. So thank you so much for listening.